Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar. Our topic today is Energy Storage Market Updates, and this webinar is a presentation of the Energy Storage Technology Advancement Partnership, also known as ESTAP. And ESTAP is a project of the Clean Energy States Alliance. Our host today is Todd Berlinski-Paul. Todd is our ESTAP Project Director at CESA. And before I pass this over to him, I'm just going to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our audience members are in listen-only mode today. That means that you can hear us, but we can't hear you. You have a couple of options for connecting to the audio portion of this webinar. You can use your computer's mic and speakers, or you can use a telephone. And you can follow the instructions that you see on your screen for that. A very important note, please do submit your questions as you think of them throughout the webinar by typing them into the question box on your webinar console and hitting send. We will be reading your questions as they come in, and we will save time at the end of our presentation today for a Q&A with the audience. So please don't wait until the end to submit your questions. Type them in as you think about them, and we will be reading through them and we'll get to them as time allows. One final announcement, this webinar is being recorded. You will find a recording of this webinar as well as all of our previous CESA webinars archived on our website at cesa.org/webinars. And now I'd like to pass it over to Todd.
Okay, thank you very much, Samantha, and welcome everybody to the webinar. This is one of our ESTAP webinars. And it's actually the first in what will become a quarterly series, so we're very excited to be debuting this. If you could advance the slide, please. So I'm going to start by giving just a little bit of background on ESTAP, which will take just a couple of minutes, and then introducing the presenters, and we will commence. So before I do that, I want to thank Dr. Emery Zhuk of US DOE Office of Electricity and Dan Borneo of Sandia National Laboratories for supporting the ESTAP project. Next slide, please. Thanks to their support, we can conduct our energy storage work, and you can see on the slide there's a map that gives you an idea of all the, well, not all, but many of the states that we're working with. We're all over the map with this work, and you know, energy storage has really taken off, and so there's a lot of interest and a lot of interest at the state level, which is what we primarily do in ESTAP. We work to not only get information out about energy storage, but also to bring states to the table to partner with DOE and the national laboratories to work on joint federal-state deployment of energy storage, and in particular demonstration projects. And we're also able to provide some technical assistance from Sandia National Laboratories to states that are developing energy storage programs, and help to make sure that those are well designed and that things get deployed and work as they're supposed to. Next slide, please. Pretty much what we do in ESTAP. This is a screenshot of our ESTAP webpage. I only present this here because I want to point out two things. One is on the left you'll see a little red arrow pointing to our ESTAP webinars button on the menu. If you go to our website and click there, you'll be able to review all of our archived webinars, which at this point goes back 3 years now, and those are archived in their entirety with both you know, visual and audio aspects. So this webinar will also be archived, and you will be able to review it whenever you want to, or send a link to somebody else. Also, there's a red circle there showing the link that you would click on if you wanted to join our mailing list, and you would do that if you wanted to be notified of future webinars, and also if you wanted to get our other information and publications. Next slide, please. And speaking of our publications, this webinar that we're about to hear has some pretty high-level discussion of energy storage markets, and there will be terms used that you may not everybody may not understand, like ancillary services and ISOs and so forth. If you feel like you need a background in this material, we recently published a report on energy storage and electricity markets that gives a good background on the whole concept of the various markets that we're going to be talking about in a moment. And you can see on your screen there is a link, and that report is available free on our website, as are all our reports. You can download it and read it at your leisure. Next slide, please. And so with that said, I would like to introduce today's guest speakers. We have Jackie DeRosa, Mike Berlinski, and Raj Chintapalli. Jackie is the Director of U.S. Emerging Technologies at CES and an expert in the energy regulatory arena and wholesale market rules. And she basically assists clients to evaluate and integrate emerging technologies into the energy markets, and also in the areas of interconnection, pricing, contract evaluation, and understanding the requirements for participating in the wholesale market. She has over 25 years of experience in the energy industry, and prior work included working at the California ISO in market design and also on international energy sector restructuring for USAID, and she began her career at the FERC. Mike Berlinski is a senior consultant for emerging technologies at CES. He joined CES in 2014, and he assists clients with market intelligence and analysis on opportunities for energy storage and other emerging technologies, especially wholesale markets. He has experience in bringing new energy storage projects online, including developing operating strategies and with the operational and financial management of projects. He was previously at Beacon Power, where he was manager of regulatory affairs. And then third and finally today, we will have Raj Chintapalli, the Director of Regulatory Affairs Ontario for CES. Raj leads regulatory policy reporting and analysis services on the ongoing developments in the Ontario electricity market, and we will have obviously a section on Ontario today as well as different regions of the U.S. So having done brief intros, and I apologize for cutting your bios short, but I do want to leave time for presentations, I'll pass this over now to Jackie DeRosa.
Well, thank you very much, Todd. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone this afternoon, or this morning for me. I'm based in Folsom, California, and to participate in this exciting ESTAP webinar. To just give an overview of what we'll be covering. First, I'll give an introduction to customized energy solutions, and then we'll review some of the trends that have been happening at the federal level that have impacted the integration of energy storage into the regional energy markets. And then finally, we'll give some information about each of these markets that are listed on the slide to let you know how things are proceeding and how energy storage can participate. Customized Energy Solutions was established in 1998. We're a privately owned corporation based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. We have offices throughout the country, also in Pune, India, and we're expanding into other international markets. CES's business lines do cover all aspects of the energy industry, and we aim to be a full service provider for consulting and market operations services so that we can take projects from their inception all the way through settlements and billing. So CES is a recognized leader for integrating energy storage into regional energy markets in the United States and internationally, and we've performed technical and economic evaluations of numerous projects in various markets throughout the United States and Canada. We've aided in project development, due diligence, investment evaluations, and really our in-depth knowledge of the market rules and the regulatory arena allow us to provide regulatory support as well as the most up-to-date market impact and pricing analyses. In fact, we've just recently been awarded a contract with the Massachusetts CEC and DOER to provide a detailed two-part energy storage study that will inform future policy and programs in Massachusetts. In addition to scheduling over 4,000 megawatts of generation load and demand response from our Market Operations Center in Philadelphia, CES schedules energy storage resources in multiple RTO markets, which are listed here. And by utilizing our in-house data acquisition system called SecureNet, we also incorporate stated charge management into our bidding strategies in order to optimize the value stream with the operation and the life of a storage asset. Our practical experience with day-to-day operation of energy storage facilities in competitive energy markets provides the CES team a base that sets us apart from other providers. So now that I've established ourselves as credible market experts, I'd like to give you some background about the evolution of energy storage in the various regional energy markets in order to provide some context and to lay the groundwork for the discussion of energy market rules that will ensue in this webinar. So as the RTOs and ISOs were developed more than a decade ago, starting back with FERC Order 888, the initial designs really focused on participation by conventional generation. New technologies such as energy storage were not initially contemplated. And today, each one of the ISOs and RTOs is really in a different place with regard to their status of integrating energy storage into their market designs. So I list here a few of the key FERC orders that have helped promote the integration of energy storage into the ISO and RTO markets. FERC Order 890 is also known as the order that was aimed at preventing undue discrimination and preference in transmission service. And this was issued way back in 2007 and modified the open access tariffs to make clear that ancillary services could be provided by non-generation resources, such as energy storage and demand response. FERC Orders 719 and 745, they've been around a while too, and FERC 719 was aimed at creating active participation by customers in the form of demand response in wholesale markets to help increase competition. FERC Order 745, which we hear a lot about right now due to the controversy over the jurisdictional aspects, was approved way back in 2012. And here that order calls for grid operators to pay the full market price, known as the locational marginal price, to economic demand resources in the real-time and day-ahead markets, as long as it's cost-effective. Finally, 755, pay-for-performance regulation. That's a big one for energy storage, and I have a slide that will review that in a little bit more detail after this slide. FERC 784 was issued just last year in 2014. It enables energy storage and other resource owners to obtain the designation of market-based rate authority. And this is mainly applicable in areas where there's not ISOs and RTOs, but the gist is that it requires all transmission-owning utilities to consider speed and accuracy of resources that are providing ancillary services. And it clarifies utility accounting procedures as well to make it easier to deploy and procure energy storage services. FERC Order 794, I have a separate slide for that one as well. 755, I'll go into more details because really it's been a game changer in the energy storage arena. You know, and as a quick review, regulation is an ancillary service. It's the amount of second-by-second controllability used in balancing generation and load. It's used to maintain scheduled frequency and intertie schedules with external control areas in real time. An important goal of FERC 755 is to produce a more efficient and economic dispatch of frequency regulation resources, as well as provide fair compensation for this added value. Under FERC Order 755, generators or other entities providing this service are compensated in a two-part structure. First, regulation service providers will receive a capacity payment reflecting the opportunity costs of the marginal resource. And the most important component of the regulation service compensation under 755 is that it makes it performance-based and reflects the amount of the up and down movement that a resource provides in response to a system operator's dispatch signal and the resource's accuracy in responding to that signal. This approach accounts for the fact that a resource with a faster ramping capability can actually provide a greater amount of capacity in the regulation market, more so than a slower ramping resource. There are some very important trends also happening right now that relate to energy storage, ancillary services, and compensation. The first relates to frequency response. So in January last year, FERC issued a final rule approving the reliability standard BAL 003-1. That's the frequency response and frequency bias setting. And this really changes the way that balancing authorities define the amount of frequency response needed to maintain interconnection frequency. And it includes the requirements for measurement and provision of frequency response. This is currently being implemented by the various regional transmission organizations. Well, subsequently, the FERC then issued a notice of proposed rulemaking, a NOPR, regarding the sale of primary frequency response service at market-based rates. And here the goal with the NOPR is to establish a clear difference between frequency regulation and frequency response. So back in the day, regulation and frequency response were really defined as one of the 6 ancillary services back in Order 888. But now FERC wants to establish these as separate and distinct services. And this ultimately would facilitate the sale of third-party frequency response and open the door to market-based sales. Another ancillary service that's currently being reviewed by FERC and some of the RTOs is reactive power. FERC has docket AD 14-7 where they're exploring the compensation approaches for this ancillary service. So as of today, some regions pay for reactive power and some don't. And the rules for providing the service mainly apply to synchronous resources. So there's now consideration of whether there should be market-based payments or cost-based payments and how they should be established. So we'll see more about this likely in the next year or so. Finally, another dominating trend, which really isn't specific to ancillary services in FERC, but something that I wanted to mention because we hear about it all the time and is very relevant to this webinar. This clearly has to do with integration of distributed energy resources, including how they can participate both behind the meter and in front of the meter in the wholesale markets. So rules for aggregations, including those related to bidding, settlements, metering, telemetry, they're being developed. And we hear about this quite a bit in California and New York, for example. That brings me to my next slide, and where I'll talk about California. You guys know California. California is definitely a place where energy storage is a viable technology. With high retail rates and incentives behind the meter, there are opportunities at the retail level and the wholesale level. And at the wholesale level, the California ISO does provide for participation by energy storage. With a single state independent system operator, there's considerable coordination among the federal and state regulations for the energy markets. So I'll review some of the various aspects of the designs and how they incorporate energy storage. First, the California ISO tariff considers energy storage as a non-generator resource, an NGR. And NGRs can participate in the energy and ancillary services markets. In addition, the ISO has developed a wholesale demand response design called Proxy Demand Response, PDR. And this enables participation of demand response from behind the meter into the California ISO's wholesale markets. So the market rules exist. Unfortunately, proxy demand response cannot yet participate in the energy regulation market at the California ISO. This is where fast responding energy storage from behind the meter could potentially obtain an added payment stream. They can do this, for example, in PJM. The California ISO is pursuing changes to their market design to further define the rules for energy storage under the NGR model, including how to incorporate the state of charge into their optimization. They are also reevaluating the baseline calculations for proxy demand response to consider other alternatives that could better address energy storage from behind the meter. The ISO is also looking into a flexible ramping product, although I have to say I've been following this one for years, and really it's unclear how energy storage would actually provide and be paid for this service. But hopefully defined in the upcoming stakeholder efforts. And finally, the ISO is looking to change frequency response and reactive power procurement. and that could have an impact on energy storage. Although I don't see right now the market design changes in the near term that would create market-based products for energy storage. But maybe down the pike we'll see something more optimal. Here I've also listed some of the state level incentives. So at the state level, there's pivotal changes that are impacting the growth of energy storage in the state, and I'll go into them in a bit more detail after reviewing the ISO's activities a bit more. So pay for performance. The California ISO is fully compliant with the FERC Order 755. However, in contrast to, say, PJM, there have been some challenges with the implementation in California. To date, improved revenue to fast storage really has not materialized, and prices continue to be low, around $10 to $12 a megawatt. Low accuracy scores have resulted in the California ISO not enforcing the minimum performance threshold, which was initially at 50%. And FERC approved the California ISO's request to lower that to 25% for 3 years. So really, the failure to decertify poorly performing resources can keep supply margins deceptively high and result in low market prices for regulation. So with low performance scores only impacting the mileage payment, there's little incentive for resources to put their costs in their mileage bid, and the low mileage prices reinforce the poor accuracy. It's a do loop. But we could see a change in this as more fast responding resources enter the marketplace, which they will be doing. I'd like to highlight that California ISO has a very forward-thinking transmission planning process compared to many of the other RTOs when it comes to energy storage. In their phase 2 of the annual planning process, which is going on right now, the California ISO provides the reliability study results. And just recently, the ISO identified numerous areas where energy storage could alleviate potential reliability solutions. The California ISO is also developing market rules for participation of distributed resources, such as energy storage. And the ISO is going to file tariff language soon with FERC to create a new distributed energy resource provider category of market participants. This new entity will be able to aggregate resources and offer energy and ancillary services into the ISO market from distribution-connected resources. I do have to say there are considerable limitations in the design, but this is a step in the right direction for energy storage. There are also additional clarifications being made in the Energy Storage and Distributed Resource Stakeholder Initiative. This is called ESTAP, which I mentioned earlier. And there is a new distributed resource proceeding that will address issues impacting distributed resources and their participation in the wholesale markets, and this has just been initiated at the California Public Utilities Commission. So this brings us to what's going on in the state initiative area. And I guess I'll just quickly say, because I know we have a lot of other regions that we're going to cover, but just to kind of review, there are two types of main procurement policies implemented in California. The first is for shorter-term procurement, also known as resource adequacy. And the second is referred to as long-term procurement, which is really looking out into the horizon for 10 years. So the first, which is referenced as resource adequacy, is California's equivalent of a capacity market, as we would refer to it in the eastern RTOs. But the jurisdiction in California for capacity differs than, say, in PJM or some of the other RTOs. Here, the jurisdiction is led by the state, but there's also considerable influence from the federal side, meaning the California ISO. So we have a one-year forward market. It's bilateral. And the design actually involves 3 different types of capacity products: system, local, and flexible. And the California ISO implements numerous aspects of the capacity design, including the offer obligations, performance requirements and penalties, and the outage rules. The ISO also forecasts the requirement for local and flexible capacity. So the cool thing, though, about the California capacity design is that it does already incorporate rules for participation by energy storage and demand response. So this is already existing in California. Other markets, it's just being contemplated. The challenge in California, however, is that the prices for capacity are very low. For longer-term procurement, the state has integrated energy storage into the long-term procurement planning process, as well as the energy storage mandate, AB 2514. And I don't plan to discuss these in detail because we're really focused on the market designs, but I'd like to say that the availability of the longer-term contracts in California has made energy storage viable for project developers of new technologies. The challenge I see, however, is that understanding how to value these storage products in the solicitations really is still, being developed. And this emphasizes the importance of clear and transparent rules in the wholesale market. It's all interrelated. I also mentioned that the CPUC is also responsible for the demand response rules in coordination with the California ISO, and is now working to integrate the DR products into the wholesale arena so that they can better relieve reliability issues closer to real time. The state also has the Self-Generation Incentive Program, which applies to energy storage, and the CEC, the Energy Commission, continues to issue solicitations for its issuance of grants as part of the Electric Program Incentive Charge, the EPIC. So ideally, things will evolve in California even further so that storage can participate in the most effective way to alleviate grid reliability concerns. And this will require clearer definitions and fair compensation for the services that the resource provides, both at the retail and the wholesale levels. So I'm going to hand my presentation now over to Mike Berlinski, who will review some of the additional markets, including PJM.
Thanks, Jackie, for that introduction and coverage of California. Certainly there's a lot going on in California, and we'll try and cover all those details and in the eastern markets as well in future webinars. So I'm hoping that I can get through the slides without too much trouble from the weather. I'm having some stormy weather here in Massachusetts where I am, but we'll get right to it, and I'll go to PJM first. I'll first talk about some of the energy storage initiatives in the PJM, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, Mid-Atlantic region, and some of the markets in that region. So PJM has been very proactive in including new technologies, very progressive in welcoming developers of new technologies and working with folks to try and find a place for technologies in their market. They have an advanced technology pilot program. They have developed new asset classes to accommodate energy storage, both an energy storage resource and a capacity storage resource. So storage that really just wants to focus on energy and ancillary services versus storage that wants to provide capacity as well. They've developed a regulation signal that is both fast ramping and energy neutral. This is the Reg D for dynamic. They have the ability to manage state of charge by asset owner, and they developed a net energy settlement for storage that is at the LMP, at the locational marginal price. So storage owner is paying wholesale rates for their net energy, not retail rates per the PJM tariff, and that energy consumed is excluded from station power charges. Again, this is per the PJM tariff. Any local utility tariffs will be separate. There's a very low minimum resource size to participate in the PJM markets, 0.1 megawatt, and that's relative to relatively higher minimum sizes of about 1 megawatt in many other regions. And the next frontier is a review of the regulation market rules. So I'll go into just some of the current regulation market rules. We don't have time to get into all of the possible changes as PJM has launched a new stakeholder initiative to review the regulation market. But this is how it currently is, how it has been. And payments to fast, accurate Reg D resources, many of them storage resources, have been relatively high. And that's why you've seen a lot of interest in PJM and regulation from the storage industry. There is a capability price and a performance price, as Jackie described, complying with the FERC Order 755 pay for performance mechanism. There is a mileage ratio, which is the ratio of the fast signal to the slow signal, and that's about a 3-to-1. And then performance score is a big factor in the performance payment. And it's important to know what that expected value is to know whether you can qualify to provide regulation and then how your payment will be affected. The market size is about 650 to 700 effective megawatts. The megawatts that PJM is reporting is in effective megawatts, and that's adjusted for performance score and benefits factor. And unfortunately, we don't have time to get into all the details like what is the benefits factor on this webinar, but in future discussions we can go into those details. In terms of the existing supply, there's almost 200 megawatts of grid-connected storage and some behind-the-meter storage operating in PJM. There's also a good amount of storage that is under construction and in other stages of development. And as I mentioned in this past summer, PJM has proposed some changes to the regulation market. They are moving ahead with a limit to the amount of Reg D volume, the amount of resources that can be on the Reg D signal at any one time, and that's on the order of 200 to 300 megawatts. And they will continue to review this cap on Reg D and other pieces of the regulation market going forward. Next, moving on to the capacity market, known as the Reliability Pricing Model, or RPM. This is a 3-year forward market with annual bidding. The market size is about the size of the whole PJM region, over 100,000 megawatts. Prices were at a premium in the most recent auction, given the new capacity performance, pay for performance for capacity rules. That's about $150 to $200 a megawatt day. So these are different price units than in regulation and energy markets. Historically, the only storage participation was by hydro pump storage resources. But recently, PJM did include a specific way for advanced energy storage, such as batteries, flywheels, and the like, to participate in the PJM capacity market as a capacity storage resource. Notably, there's no minimum duration requirement, but there is a check for reasonableness. If you are cleared as a capacity resource, you are obligated to provide energy during certain hours, and there are penalties for non-performance. You can also aggregate resources across resource types between intermittent renewables, demand response, energy efficiency, and energy storage, and offer that as a single resource. If you missed the most recent auction, the next one will be in May of 2016. Again, that's on a 3-year forward basis. And then finally, some of the state activities in the PJM region. A lot of states are doing programs for energy storage or distributed energy resources. In New Jersey, there was a solicitation for the Renewable Electric Storage Program. In 2015, 13 projects totaling 9 megawatts were awarded $3 million. And in 2016, the state plans to award up to $6 million. New Jersey also has an energy resilience bank, similar to the green banks of other states. In Maryland, there is a grant program, as well as the General Assembly or Legislature has been having some hearings on energy storage. So a lot of interest, both specifically energy storage and more generally distributed resources. You see the District of Columbia has distribution system planning proceeding, and there are a number of states with renewable portfolio standards that do explicitly include energy storage as an eligible technology. And every state has different specific requirements for just what type of energy storage and what can and cannot that energy storage resource do in order to get the RPS credits. Now I'll move on to New England. So ISO New England energy storage initiatives go back to a alternative technology regulation pilot program that began in 2008. This was to allow other storage resources beyond hydro pump storage to participate in the ISO's regulation market. 6.5 years later, this pilot program concluded, it terminated, and now the market is open to energy storage. There is a testing environment for new technologies that may or may not be ready for the market. You can go into the testing environment, and then if you pass that test, you can then participate alongside other conventional resources in the ISO's regulation market. There is a new asset class, alternative technology regulation resource. The minimum size is 1 megawatt, so that is important to note. There are a variety of net energy settlement options, but the important point is that you can settle net energy at wholesale prices and avoid the station power charges. And also ISO New England created a variety of dispatch signals, including a energy neutral signal that looks a lot like the PJM Reg D signal for limited duration storage resources. A little more details about the ISO New England regulation market, as that is of a lot of interest to energy storage developers. It's a relatively small market. Only about 60 megawatts is procured each hour, and that's relative to the 600 plus megawatts of PJM. New England has paid for regulation mileage since 2005. However, it was not fully compliant with Order 755 until the spring of this year, and it made a couple changes to become fully compliant. Now resources are paid both capacity and mileage, and the payment, the revenue, is affected by the accuracy in following the signal. So it's very important to stay within these envelopes and perform accurately, because that does affect the payment. Now some state activities in New England. Massachusetts, of course, has launched an energy storage initiative and will be deciding how to spend up to $10 million in energy storage programs. Massachusetts has been working with utilities on a grid modernization effort. It has provided a number of resiliency grants. A lot of the projects do include energy storage. And there is an alternative energy portfolio standard credit for flywheels. Connecticut has a microgrid program and has awarded money to a number of projects. Some do include batteries, as well as a green bank. And Maine and Vermont also have some notable clean energy, distributed energy projects that do include energy storage. And now I'll go down to ERCOT and the Texas market. First, some energy storage initiatives in Texas from the Public Utility Commission of Texas. The PUCT did have a rule change to allow energy storage settlements at wholesale nodal energy price. However, only some of the loads at a plant will be considered wholesale storage load and eligible for this wholesale energy price treatment. So it's important to really understand the details of that rules and what exactly will require a meter and what exactly can be settled at the wholesale energy price. Also, the PUCT gave ERCOT, the grid operator, the authority to conduct pilot projects, and one such pilot project was a fast responding regulation service. This lasted for a year and allowed alternative technologies to participate and provide fast regulation. And now that fast regulation service has become a subset of the regular regulation service. There is a limit to the amount of capacity that currently can participate under the FRRS program. However, there is discussion underway to raise that limit. The ERCOT regulation market is a decent size relative to some other ISOs. It's important to note that it is not bidirectional, so there are separate products for regulation up and regulation down. It does have a relatively low minimum resource size of just 0.1 megawatts. In terms of the resource performance criteria, this FRRS program is kind of a hybrid between frequency response and frequency regulation. So the resources need to be able to automatically detect frequency and provide full response within a second. Also must be able to respond to control signals, more of a traditional secondary control or regulation control, and provide the right amount of power upon deployment. It is a limited deployment in terms of duration, so limited duration resources are able to participate. The payment for this FRRS is the same as the regular regulation, so that there is no pay for performance in line with FERC Order 755 in ERCOT. And now ERCOT is talking about future ancillary services, acknowledging that there are new technologies and that possibly unbundling some of their existing services will be a benefit to the market. They have a product responsive reserve service that is kind of a hybrid between frequency response and spinning reserve, so that is under discussion to be unbundled. There were a number of meetings over the last couple years. There is still discussion going on, specifically how to procure and price frequency response, but this will be could be one of the first markets where frequency response will be a formal and paid market product. ERCOT and collaborators are working on a cost-benefit analysis to show stakeholders both the cost and benefit of this wholesale redesign of its ancillary service markets. And now I'll go on to SPP. So SPP is one of the more recent ISO's RTOs, and as such, it has not created formal rules for energy storage resources like the other ISOs have. However, very recently, a stakeholder submitted a request to change the rules and to add explicit rules for energy storage, and that'll be discussed this fall. So we look forward to that discussion. The SPP just started full ISO market operations in March of 2014, and then had extension to comply with Order 755, and that happened in March of 2015. The design is a lot like MISO that we'll hear about in a little bit. It's a moderately sized regulation market. There are separate reg up and reg down products, and a relatively low minimum resource size of 0.1 megawatts. Again, like other ISOs under 755, there are both capacity and mileage prices and payments for regulation. And again, the accuracy is important to determine what is the payment. Also, the amount of mileage that the resource provides is very important in understanding the total payment. And now I'll turn it over to Raj to go on to the other regions.
Thank you again, Mike and Todd. So I would, in the next 10-15 minutes, I will talk about the developments and initiatives in Midwest ISO, Mid-Continent ISO, New York and Ontario. So I wanted to give you, so you don't hear too much of storage and related initiatives in MISO, so I thought I should give you a brief history. In fact, in MISO, the discussions about storage started long back, even in going back up to from 2003. In 2005, MISO members, some MISO member states like Iowa municipal utilities, they had actually initiated a project called as ISEPA, Energy Storage Project, with the intent to explore explore a compressed air energy storage project with the goal to store all the wind. As we know, in Iowa has a lot of wind resources, store the low-cost wind during the night and use it during the day for peaking. After a few years of investigation and research, this project was did not go further for reasons, one being the geology, but other factors. But there were a lot of learnings from that, and one of the important learnings was MISO as a market did not have the revenue streams to actually value the benefits that the storage can provide. So you'll find a lot of more information about ISEPA on the website. I added this here just to give you like, okay, there is a history of storage in MISO, and it goes back to 2003. Following that, I want to talk on MISO stored energy resource. One of the things that Jackie mentioned in her presentation was the FERC Order 890, which actually was intended to eliminate or remove any barriers or to provide non-generation alternatives to provide frequency service into the market. So as a result of that, by FERC Order 890, MISO first implemented or defined. MISO was in fact the first market, I think, in US which actually defined storage as a resource in the market. MISO launched the ASA market, Ancillary Services Market, in 2009, and that is when they included SCR as one of the resources to be able to provide services to the market. Initially, it was allowed to provide sync reserves and regulation as well as non-sync, but later on they modified it to be only provide regulation service. Further what MISO did is one was driven by the learnings from the SEPAR project. Then the FERC Order 890, MISO initiated an energy storage study in 2011. The whole intent was to understand the economic benefits that the storage can provide to the grid. The plan was to do study in two phases. Phase 1 to understand at high level the benefits, and phase 2 was going to be a more deeper dive. The phase 1 concluded with results like, okay, there are economic benefits, and the granularity, phase 2 was going to discuss that in more granular level, how to quantify those benefits. But to date, phase 2 has not yet taken place. Other news that you hear these days coming from MISO is the IPL 20 megawatt battery storage project that is in development, and it is planned to come online in the next half of first half of 2016. Another development in MISO is MISO is launching the new ramping product. It's going to be in 2016. SER, as defined in MISO right now, cannot provide the service, but we think energy storage has the capabilities to provide ramping services. So this needs further investigation as to what are the rules in MISO, what product can provide, but it is more like if a product can provide spinning, it can provide ramping. So talking more about the stored energy resource, again, MISO first defined the SCR in 2009 in the ASA markets. When they defined it, it's a storage device with 1 hour or less duration, and it is eligible only to provide regulation reserve only. And MISO manages the state of charge of any SCR. As we saw in other markets like PJM and California, and so MISO is fully compliant with the FERC Order 755, where stored energy resource or any resource providing regulation should be compensated for the service that it provides to the market, and not just the capacity as it used to be before the pay for performance. The MISO market size for regulation on average is 396, but the maximum it procures up to 400 megawatts of regulation at any point of time. MISO does the state of charge management, as already stated, and the minimum size of the resource required to participate in the market is 1 megawatt. Other changes in MISO is settle net energy at the wholesale prices, and also the station power is excluded from the retail charges. So this is just to give a difference between, okay, one of the things in MISO is MISO filters, okay, just a small. So MISO, any system operator dispatches resources by sending a signal called as AGC, automatic generator control signal, to different resources to move up and down as required to maintain the frequency. Every system operator has a different mechanism how this signal is generated and when and how often it is sent. On the left side is what you would see is today's signal to the MISO. MISO, when it dispatches resources for regulation, the way it does is it has divided all the regulation resources into 5 equal groups. with the first group being the fastest ramp rates, having resources with the fastest ramp rate. So once MISO determines how much regulation is needed, the first group is dispatched first. Once it is maxed out, it goes to the next group and the third group. But having said that, but MISO has some resources that cannot react as fast as ideally is possible, or ideally system operator would require. So MISO actually puts a filter on the signal to enable its existing fleet of resources to respond to the signal. MISO is planning to make some changes. MISO is planning to make some changes as to the signal that it will be sending to the fast response resources. So now, as a result of FERC Order 755, the resource gets paid based on the mileage. Mileage is nothing but how much the resource is used. So on the left side, the blue line shows the mileage, or the distance that is traveled by storage in providing the resource regulation service to the market. But as and when MISO changes the signal, what you would see is something like in the right. It is not exactly like this, because this is some model that we have developed based on some assumptions that we have made, but it is definitely more, 2 times compared to what it is today. What are the drivers for storage in MISO as we see it today? One is, as I just discussed, the AGC fast signal, AGC automatic generation controller signal. Then renewable integration. MISO has currently has 14,000 megawatts of installed wind. There's going to be 20,000 in near future by 2020. So that's one that's going to drive storage. Then state initiatives. Not much is happening at the state as in California and other states, but one such we are aware of was a study that was done by Minnesota Energy Storage. Going to New York. So New York, similar to MISO, the first New York ISO started implementing or defining stored use or making rule changes for stored energy resource was in 2009. And New York also, like MISO, does the 5-minute state of the charge management, and the minimum regulation resource requirement is 1 megawatt. In lieu of time that we have, I'm trying to move a little faster, but if there are any questions, then please let us know, type it in the panel, and we can answer them, or maybe get back to you after this presentation. So MISO market for regulation, New York ISO, New York ISO procures approximately 215 megawatts, but as compared to other markets, NYISO actually, the regulation megawatt that is procured every hour and every month. Now NYISO changes the amount of regulation that is procured every hour based on the month and the season, and NYISO posts that on the website. It can be as little as 150 megawatt to maximum of 300 megawatts. So other drivers for storage in New York ISO is, as you all know, New York NYSERDA is the State Energy Research Development Authority, provides a lot of funding for new innovative energy technologies, energy efficiency, and also for projects that provide renewable integration. One such initiative under NYSERDA is the New York Prize that actually funds projects for microgrids, and storage can get funded for projects in those microgrids. Similar to Green Bank is an initiative that we are hearing about in all the states. Is basically it's for projects that are categorized as clean tech projects. Further, other programs are utility tariffs and incentives. One that you will hear very often and commonly is the CONNET Demand Response Management Program, providing incentives up to $2,100 per kilowatt for adding storage. Then going to New York Public Service Commission REV initiative. That's another big initiative in New York ISO, where they want to change how the utility of the future would look like independent system operator at the grid level. Similarly, there could be a distributed system operator at the distribution level, providing customers a lot of choice. And NYISO is discussing rules for behind-the-meter generation to participate in the markets and more. Coming to Ontario, so Ontario is the leader, has been the leader in actually deploying storage, not only policies and things like that. Ontario's experiment with the storage started in 2012 when they actually issued an RFP for regulation pilot, RFP to procure alternative technologies to provide regulation services. Through that RFP, Ontario procured 10 megawatts of fast responding resources that included battery, flywheel, and demand response resources. Planning in Ontario is driven by long-term energy plan. The ELTAP 2013, the most recent one, had a target to procure 50 megawatt of storage. And in the first phase, NYISO issued an RFP and procured up to 33.5 megawatts, and including different technologies like battery, hydrogen, thermal. So phase one was targeted for grid-connected projects, and NYISO has issued an RFP following that for the remaining 16.5 megawatt. It is more for distributed connected projects, and the compensation would be more like a peaking product or capacity product, and the results are expected anytime in fall 2015. Further, Ontario has a smart grid energy fund through which it supports a lot of new smart grid projects. Very recently, they announced 17 projects were offered 23 million support. Of that, 6 projects had some storage. 3 were storage and 3 were microgrids. And for providing all the services that we hear, the storage can provide peak management, renewable integration, and utility power outage and backup. Drivers for storage in future, renewable integration. Ontario has a typical problem called a surplus baseload generation, which for now it is expected going to last only through 2020. But having said that, Ontario plans to add like 10,000 megawatts of wind by 2022. That's going to be almost 15 to 20% of the generation capacity. So this is going to bring in a lot of variability on the grid. So in order to manage the variability, Ontario nowadays talks about flexibility, and that requirement of having a flexible system would drive a lot of storage in Ontario. Then there is other initiatives like CDM initiatives. The goal is to actually conserve up to 7 terawatt hours of energy by 2022, and if storage can be part of that initiative with LECs, then there are opportunities to participate. Then Ontario very recently announced joining the cap and trade program with Quebec and California. So they could, based on how the rules get defined in the next few months, I think then that would help storage to participate, to be able to provide the assist California, or sorry, assist Ontario in the cap and trade program. Then, so primary drivers of storage in Ontario are regulatory mandates like ELTAP 2013, 50 megawatt procurement, followed by that there is also a note in the ELTAP 2003 for a study to integrate storage, for opportunities to integrate storage with renewable projects greater than 500 kW. Very recently, the ministry issued a directive asking for to review the outcomes of the previous procurement and come up with new ways or suggest or recommend options to integrate storage in Ontario electricity marketplace. This is all I have. Given the time I have rest, but please send me questions. Thank you very much. Mike,
okay. Thank you very much, and thanks to all our presenters. We do have a large number of questions, and we'll get to as many as we can. One thing that a number of people wanted to know is what is going on in PJM. We hear there's a temporary cap on Reg D or fast regulation. What's the situation, and what can we look for in terms of an outcome?
Yeah, thank you. This is Mike. I can take that one. So what PJM has proposed a cap on Reg D, a hard cap. Thus far, there had been no hard cap on the amount of Reg D capacity that PJM would schedule in any 1 hour. So at times, the amount of resources following the Reg D signal had gotten very high, over 50%. There are times when the need for dispatch requires a very long deployment of regulation. The Reg D signal is coded to reset after a number of minutes, the time constant on the order of 15 minutes. That left PJM operators in a challenge. The solution to that, the immediate and interim solution, is to limit the amount of capacity following the Reg D signal that PJM will procure. That's on the order of 200 or 300 megawatts. It depends on the hour of the day. Generally, it's about 300 megawatts. There are a handful of hours, just 6 hours, the morning and evening ramp, where that number will be limited to 200 megawatts. That is expected to go into place in a couple months. That will stay in place. It will be reviewed on a quarterly basis. However, it might be changed or removed depending on subsequent market rule changes in PJM. PJM is going to be considering dispatch signal, the amount of regulation it should procure, the performance scores one needs to qualify, the clearing mechanisms, the compensation formulas. All of that will be under review, and those may allow a change to that cap.
Okay, terrific. So as of now, the cap isn't in effect, but is about to be. Does that mean that that the market is sort of artificially saturated now, or what does that mean in terms of if you're building a project right now in PJM and you want to bid into that market?
Right, good question. So I would say briefly, there are almost 200 megawatts of advanced storage resources operating in PJM primarily, and they are providing frequency regulation primarily. In addition to that, there's gas-fired resources and hydro resources that are qualified to provide Reg D. So you have up to 600 megawatts of resources that are qualified to provide Reg D. The cap going into place will be on the order of 200 to 300 megawatts. So there will be more qualified supply than the cap will allow. PJM procures regulation on a least cost basis, so it'll sort the resources based on cost. PJM is instituting a new rule where beyond cost, if there is a tie across costs, say if everybody bids the same, if everybody bids zero, for example, then PJM will procure based on performance. And so those with the highest performance scores and least cost will be cleared first. So then it'll be up to resources to that'll have the best performance score to clear. You might beat out another resource, but you do have to look at all the competition to determine whether you have a high likelihood or not of clearing. If there is a limit to the amount of Reg D, there is also Reg A. So the Reg A signal is for conventional resources. It has some very long holds. It has energy bias. So generally, conventional resources provide that. Pump storage resources can provide that. So in theory, a very long duration battery can also provide that. So something else to consider.
Great, thank you. Here's a question about the California market. Why is the pricing for energy storage in the capacity market low when the retail pricing is in the 25-cent range in California?
So I think the question has to do with the capacity portion of the regulation payment, and it could have to do with the resource adequacy capacity payment. Both are low. So the first has to do with the fact that there's really no fast responding resources in the regulation market yet, although the design does accommodate fast responding resources through what's called regulation energy management. There's really only one resource so far participating in that. And so the existing resources have what's called very low accuracy, and so the ISO is really, they would have to disqualify resources who were not performing at the accuracy level that they needed to be. So really, the existing generation resources are putting all of their, bids into their capacity portion of the regulation bid. So they're not putting it into the mileage portion. So the capacity prices are, consistent with kind of how they have been, but it's the mileage that's very low. So if the question was related to regulation, then that's the answer for that. if it has to do with the resource adequacy capacity payments, California traditionally has very low RA capacity payments, and which really infers that there's an oversupply of resource adequacy capacity. And it has to do with a lot of other reasons as well, just the overall market design and the fact that really the primary, those who are primarily procuring resource adequacy are the load-serving entities, of which there are 3 that really have the bulk of the market share. We don't have retail, we only have limited retail choice in California. So the RA payments in general are low in California. It's bilateral, so it's behind the scenes. It's not a centralized clearing price. We don't see reflection of the cost of new entry in our capacity market pricing. So I think as time goes on and there's less flexible capacity available, then the supply will go down, and then the price of that product, there's 3 RA products, system, flexible, and local, will likely go up. And local capacity right now is paid a premium, so that's not as low as system capacity, but really it just comes down to an oversupply of capacity currently.
Okay, thank you. Well, you mentioned mileage, and one of our participants actually asked if you would please explain the concept of mileage. How is mileage different than total hours of energy storage system operation?
Yeah, good question. I think any one of us, I'll jump out first. So mileage is a term sort of defined or given explicit definition in FERC Order 755 as the metric by which regulation service would be measured. There were discussion of whether the payment should be both regulation capacity, how many megawatts are set aside in reserve to provide regulation, and megawatt hours, how much energy is provided in the course of providing regulation. But FERC decided to use mileage, which is the absolute value of the change in output of a resource in the course of providing regulation. So ramping up and down the changing its output level, and when you sum all of that movement, that is the mileage. So if you start at 0, you go up to 1 megawatt, and then you go back down to 0 megawatts, you've just moved 2 miles. And so your payment will be that volume of mileage, 2 miles, times the price for mileage in a $1 per mile fashion. And so that is how half of the compensation for regulation is determined. Mileage is different than megawatts of capacity held in reserve, and it's different than energy, the megawatt hours that are produced or withdrawn in the course of following a signal.
Okay, thanks. And I think that really the key is mileage has to do with performance, and if you want to get a better understanding of it, we have a report that we put out recently from Clean Energy Group that gives a pretty good background on these markets and concepts like ancillary services and mileage. Maybe we can get that slide back up, Samantha, so that people can see where to get that report. But if you imagine that the signal says, I want you to go from 0 to 100, but you're in a very slow to accelerate vehicle, so you can only go from 0 to 100 over the course of, say, a mile of road, then you're not doing very well in terms of performance. Whereas if you could go from 0 to 100 instantly, your performance is very good. And that concept kind of applies to storage. Fast responding resources can go from 0 to 100 very quickly, so therefore they're credited with better performance, and it's called mileage. Somebody else wants to know whether the panelists could speak to the level of measurement and verification through metering and sensors that the ISOs have in terms of monitoring these ancillary service providers, especially in PJM. In other words, do they contract with the customer and then periodically measure and verify that the necessary capacity or performance is being provided, or is it real time?
Yeah, thanks. This is Mike. I'll start, and others can add on. But generally, if you're going to provide wholesale services to the ISO, you need a revenue grade meter, and that'll measure a number of items and telemeter in real time back and forth with the ISO in terms of what is instantaneous power and what is the energy over time. And so that revenue grade meter, and in some cases, sub-meters and multiple meters might be needed. Whether you're behind the meter or in front of the meter, you're going to need accurate information so that the ISOs can measure and verify this information. Certainly there's a set of measurement and verification rules for demand response providers. At a high level, it's similar. Good quality metering is needed to provide capacity energy ancillary services to the ISOs. Jackie or Raj, did you want to add anything to that?
Mike, you did right. Yeah.
I would just add that for purposes of ancillary services, usually a rig is needed, which is really like an encrypted RTU, and each of the ISOs and RTUs have, specific requirements for the types of protocols that are accepted. So California, for example, is has different rules than those in PJM. They're evolving and they're changing to better accommodate aggregations, and rules for behind the meter participation really are still kind of in the works in California, whereas in PJM they're a little bit more evolved.
Great, thank you. Well, you mentioned that we've talked a bit about differences between the different ISOs, and one of the things that seems to be different is the capacity threshold for entry into some of these markets. So, for example, in PJM, you could bid as a regulation resource if you have a 100 kilowatt system, whereas in some other ISOs you might need half a megawatt or a megawatt in order to get in, unless you are part of an aggregated resource. Is there any chance for getting some kind of standardization so that products could be brought to commercialized that would be viable products in any market, rather than, well, you're viable here but you're not viable there simply because you can't meet a threshold for entry?
That's a good question. This is Mike. I'll start. I would see it as challenging. I think each ISO has its own process, its own set of rules. Certainly they need to comply with FERC orders, but I'm not sure. It's been argued before FERC whether this minimum size has to be one level or another. So I see it as a challenge to get all the ISOs to establish a standard parameter for this particular one. I've seen it sort of discussed again and again at each ISO. That said, there might be some motivation for FERC to provide something top-down, or for the ISOs to share notes and work on that. But I'm not aware of much activity at this point on that. Jackie, did you want to add anything?
I don't have anything to add. I think that's it's challenging and interesting at the same time how each ISO and RTO implements the rules differently. And I guess unless there was some movement to standardize, I don't really see that happening.
Okay, great. Somebody wants to know what Massachusetts could learn from California to move forward quickly with storage and distributed generation at residential, commercial, and utility scales, which is, if sort of taking the question at face value, seems more about, state policies than markets, but extrapolating a little bit, are there lessons learned from some of these markets that other regions, might do well to pick up on? Are there, are there sort of keys to why some of these markets are more successful than others?
So I think this is Jackie. I think that is, it's such a broad question, and it's right on, because I think there's a lot to be learned from different markets, but each market is so specific to the individual needs. For example, Massachusetts might have more of a grid resiliency need than, say, California, or California has more renewables, so maybe the grid reliability and flexible ramping needs are more, are highly valued. So I think the idea is to, what Massachusetts is doing is conducting a two-part study to really, evaluate the industry landscape in Massachusetts, the, opportunities for economic development in the Commonwealth, and then really evaluating what kind of, policy opportunities and justifications could be made, based on what's done elsewhere and related specifically to situations in Massachusetts. So I don't have a direct answer for that. I don't mean to talk around it, but I think, sure, I think, yes, a lot of what's happened in California is relevant, but is it directly applicable? I don't know yet. I think that's something that we are going to pursue and evaluate, and see if some of the programs that have been implemented here would work elsewhere.
Okay. We have a question from someone who's sort of stepping away from ancillary services for a moment to talk about a different challenge for grid level storage, which this person identifies as the fact that storage can save nearby renewables from having to curtail. They can help nearby conventional generators run better, but how do those benefits get monetized back to the storage owner for purposes of being able to finance? And this is a sort of a basic question for emerging technologies. How do you get paid in a very complex interactive system like these energy markets? How do you get paid for benefits you may be providing to others, but there's no mechanism there for compensation?
Yeah, I think I can.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Mike. So yeah, I think that is one of the drawbacks, I would say, of this RTO type of market structure, and that is what was concluded at the end of the ICEPA study that was conducted in MISO. The RTO mechanism does not have a mechanism to value the benefit that the storage can provide for to the grid. So it's a challenge.
Yep, I would agree.
I think in California there is an attempt to monetize some of that, but it definitely falls short. For example, I mentioned the creation of a flexible ramping product, where potentially energy storage could participate in that revenue stream, but it's not clear, whether or not even that product will be developed, and if it's based on what currently is procured as a constraint, the amount and the price would be low, and and then California has also proceeded with, they really need flexible capacity on the grid, so there's been the development of the flexible capacity resource adequacy product, which we discussed. The prices are very low right now, but the idea is to provide some type of revenue for those resources that can provide the ability to be flexible, to help with these ramping and load following conditions. But is it enough, and is it enough to provide a revenue stream, and has it been fully thought through? No, I don't think so. I think there's a lot of debate between all the different participants on the grid, and the grid was really developed not considering these new resources. So, I mean, if we had to do it all again, I think the market designs would really be quite different. But now we already have tools and optimizations that you can't just modify at the blink of an eye. So we have to work with what we have and figure out a way to compensate, whether it be through ancillary services or a new flexible ramping product or through the capacity markets.
Yeah, I want to add to that. So we have an example as to how that can be monetized. That goes to Ontario, but thing is like that's not possible in US. In Ontario, the ISO, the recent RFP is for 16.5 megawatt, where storage ISO is asking for like 4 megawatts of storage, and ISO will decide how it wants to use that storage. And so a resource, ISO would enter into contract with the selected participants, and now ISO can call on the resource for whatever services it needs. So that's basically monetizing. So ISO can use it for maybe for demand management, renewable integration, reactive support, and all the benefits that we talk about when we talk about storage. So there's an example of ISO in Ontario, but from what I know about the ISOs and RTOs in US, it is currently not possible. It would require ISOs to get into contract with the suppliers.
Okay, thank you. Here's a very specific question regarding PJM. What's the average performance score? I'm assuming they're talking about for Reg D. It's not specified.
Right, that's a good question. So PJM has put out information about average performance score by signal, as well as further by resource type. So I think I remember the RTO-wide average performance score for regulation was about 80%, and the percentage to qualify for regulation is 75%. Now you have a mix of resource types between fossil, hydro, storage, and resources classified as demand response, a mix of technologies behind the meter, providing Reg A and Reg D. In terms of Reg D, there's a mix of technologies and performance scores. The batteries, the storage are generally in the 90s. The hydro might be in the 70s or 80s. The gas, it might be in the 80s or 90s. And similarly for Reg A, you'll have a mix of some resource types, and some will be in the 70s or 80s, and some might be in the 80s or 90s. But I would say 80% average for regulation, and then a range across signal and across resource types.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to say I think we're gonna go for another 4 minutes here, and then we'll call it. So a couple more questions, and then we'll finish this. You are talking about these performance scores. I think Jackie, you may have been the one who mentioned earlier that California ISO failed to decertify poorly performing resources. Can you just elaborate a little bit on how that? I guess instead they lowered the bar. Is that right? Am I understanding that correctly? So then if that's the case, how does that affect pricing and opportunities for storage?
Sorry, I was on mute. I apologize. So yes, the resources appear to be bidding in California the same as they did before Order 755 was implemented. So the bulk of the bid is in the capacity component as opposed to the mileage component. There's a prevalence of $0 mileage bids. And the reason is because the default setting in the ISO allows for only 25% of accuracy. So there are low accuracy scores. They were unable to enforce the 50% minimum performance threshold because the resources that are providing the service couldn't meet that. So I guess what I was trying to say is that with low performance scores, right, that impact the mileage payment, there's a little incentive for a resource to put their cost in their mileage bid. So they just continue to bid the mileage into their capacity portion of the bid. And it does, I think it reinforces the low prices reinforce the poor accuracy. So and in fact, even the Department of Market Monitoring did come out with some comments on this because the ISO had to justify what they were doing, and Department of Market Monitoring came out and even said that, and don't quote me on this because I might not have it exactly right. I'm just kind of talking off the I recall. But you know, given that the fact that the market clearing price for mileage is relatively low, the economic incentive for resources to respond accurately, you know, to the 4-second control signal might not be sufficient. So I guess what does that mean? You know, and it just means that ancillary services in California really haven't gone to the same. They haven't moved like they have in PJM. The price for regulation, but when faster responding resources begin participating, it's likely that they'll put more of their bid into the mileage component, and the prices could go up.
Okay, thank you. And I want to just say that this has been a fantastic webinar, and I just want to reiterate that this is the first in a series of quarterly market updates on energy storage services markets that we'll be doing, and we look forward to having everybody come back in 3 months for the second one. And also we will be sending out a sort of a summary document of the information presented at this webinar. So if you signed up for the webinar, you look for that in your email, and that's just something that we thought would be a nice thing to provide for everybody. Also upcoming in October, it's the anniversary of Superstorm Sandy. We have a number of upcoming webinars in October around that anniversary. I don't know, Samantha, do you have any dates that you want to, titles you want to give out?
Sure. We have, I think, 4 webinars scheduled for October. All of those you can find information on at our website at CESA.org/webinars. But just to give a few dates, we have one upcoming on October 8th, that is Fuel Cells for Educational Facilities. And then on October 14th, we have a webinar entitled Severe Weather and the Reliability of the U.S. Electric Power Grid. And there's a few more coming up. So you can visit our website on the web address on your screen to find out more.
Okay, very good. Thanks again to everybody. Thanks to our presenters, and we will see you again next time.